Imagine your perfect retirement. Over the years, you've saved every cent you could and managed to buy a yacht. Now you're living the salt life, and it is indeed well deserved. But priorities change, and your kids have kids, and now you're a grandparent. And as time goes by, you realize you'd rather watch them grow up than set sail to another exotic locale. That's how it was for Thomas and Jackie Hawks. But just when their happy ending was within reach, evil snatched it away. I'm Chris, and this is True Crime Recaps. Every week, my wife Amy and I are here bringing you all the crime in half the time. And if that sounds good to you, I hope you'll give this a like and hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a recap. Now, on with the story. On November 15th, 2004, Tom and Jackie Hawks took some potential buyers out on a test run of their 55-foot yacht, the Well Deserved. Tom was a 57-year-old recently retired probation officer. His wife Jackie was a stay-at-home to his two sons. And for the last 2 years, they'd been living on the yacht, sailing around the Pacific from their dock in Newport Harbor, California. The couple met at a chili cook-off in 1986, and it was love at first sight. Tom wrestled in college and was a bodybuilder. Jackie was an up-for-anything fitness buff, and they shared a passion for boating. They were a perfect match, and in 1989 they made it official. Together, they worked hard, saved where they could, and managed to retire early and buy a boat they could live on. They intended to live to the fullest and chase adventures across the ocean. But by 2004, it was time to get their land legs back. Their first grandson had just come into the world, and Tom and Jackie wanted to be there with him for every moment. Especially Jackie. She always loved kids but couldn't have any of her own. And Tom had 2 sons from his first marriage, and when Jackie came into the picture, the boys were in grade school, but from the start, they loved her like a second mother. And she couldn't wait to be a grandma. It was tough to say goodbye to the well-deserved because it had, in fact, been a well-deserved part of their life, but they were excited to start a new chapter with family in Arizona. Now, you're probably watching this from the deck of your own lavish yacht, but just in case you're not, let me give you a quick rundown of the ins and outs of boat buying. It's a lot like buying a luxury car, and just like you would if you were in the market for a Rolls, you would go to a dealership, right? It's the same concept here. The buyer and seller agree on the price, and then they seal the deal with a sea trial, like test driving a car. Most people go through a yacht broker, but just like a car salesman, they charge a hefty commission, and Tom and Jackie were frugal. Saving their pennies is how they managed to buy well-deserved in the first place. So they decided to sell it themselves. They put an ad in Yachting World magazine describing its 2 decks, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and galley, all for the very fair price of $435,000. Not long after the ad went up, they got a bite. A man and his wife were interested in taking it out for a sea trial, and their names were Skylar and Jennifer Deleon. On November 12th, Tom and Jackie celebrated the pending sale with one last trip to Santa Catalina Island off the coast of Los Angeles. They toasted their upcoming move to Arizona with friends and reminisced about all the good times they had had on the boat over the years. 3 days later, Skylar showed up for their scheduled sea trial, but he wasn't alone. He had 2 guys with him, Alonzo Machane and John Kennedy. Now, you know how they say cops can always spot an ex-con? Well, it's no different for probation officers. With one look, Tom knew this might be trouble, and his instincts were right on. John used to be part of the Long Beach Insane Crips. He served time for attempted murder, but made a show of turning his life around and becoming a youth minister when he was released. But being a good guy didn't stick, and that night, he was there to be the muscle. He'd been hired only hours before to make sure everything went as planned. But if Tom and Jackie asked, he was the accountant. Alonzo was no choir boy either, but he should have been someone you could trust. He worked as a guard for the city of Seal Beach Jail. That's where he met the leader of their little group, Skylar Deleon. Skylar was serving time for burglary. He was an LA cliché. His overbearing father forced him into auditions as a kid. His big claim to fame was a bit part in the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers in 1993 and 94. Other than that, he'd been in a few commercials, but never really made it big. He talked a lot about how much he hated the industry, and his father took every cent he made anyway. At 20, he joined the Marines but went AWOL after only 15 days. And that's pretty much how things went for him. couldn't stick with anything, and wasn't great at anything except lying. And once he saw Tom and Jackie's reaction to the three of them on the dock, he dug deep and put on the show of his life. But to really pull it off, he needed a helping hand from the fourth member of his group, his wife, Jennifer. The Hawks were expecting just her and Skylar that night, and it was pretty obvious they didn't feel comfortable getting on board with him and two other strangers. So Jennifer stepped in. Using her 2-year-old daughter as a prop, she immediately won over Jackie. But she couldn't go with them. She said she was pregnant and not feeling well, so a boat ride was probably a bad idea. But no one expects a pretty young pregnant woman to be an evil mastermind. So, after a few minutes of chatting together, Jackie and Tom welcomed Skylar, John, and Alonzo on board. The last thing they saw was Jennifer and the baby waving goodbye from the dock. We know what happened next because one of the guys on board talked, and I have to warn you, it's one of the most disturbing things you'll ever hear. As they were headed out toward Catalina, the group split up. Alonzo stuck with Jackie while Tom showed Skylar and John around below deck. That's where they jumped him. Tom was a big man. He knew how to defend himself. It took 2 guys and a taser to overpower him and get him in cuffs. Meanwhile, up above, Jackie was fighting with Alonzo, trying to get to her husband, but in the end, she was also handcuffed. Their eyes and mouths were taped shut, and they were tossed on a bed with their backs to each other. But Tom managed to find his wife's hand, and he stroked it to comfort her. One by one, they were led to the main cabin and forced to sign and fingerprint a deed of sale, transferring the boat to Skylar and Jennifer and a power of attorney, giving them control over their money and assets. But Jackie was smart. She didn't know how the situation was going to end for them, but she wasn't about to hand over their life savings without leaving some kind of trail for investigators to follow. So, she deliberately left the S's off her last name when she signed it. It was a small clue, but one that would eventually help crack the case. When the paperwork was taken care of, Skylar hauled the 65-pound anchor up, and the couple was forced to the back of the boat. Tom appeared calm, waiting for a chance to escape. But Jackie was screaming, "We trusted you, and your wife came over. You had your little girl over. Why are you doing this?" She begged for their lives, pleading with them to let them be with their new grandson. Jackie was scared and shaking, but Tom told her, "No matter what happens, we'll be together." Without a word, Skylar cuffed their hands to the end of the anchor chain. And in one last act of defiance, Tom made his move. He kicked up and back, tossing Skylar on his butt. Then John hauled off and hit him in the head, knocking him out. And with that, the anchor dropped. And Tom and Jackie were dragged to the bottom of the icy cold ocean. Their bodies have never been found. Skylar's only reaction was an excited yelp of victory, and he turned the boat around and headed back to the dock. Jennifer and their daughter were waiting for them. She wasn't surprised to see her husband and the others return without the Hawks. She and Skylar plotted it together, and he'd been calling her with updates the whole time. She always wanted to be rich, but she married a loser, and they'd racked up more than $100,000 in debt. She was working as a hairstylist to make ends meet, while Skylar stayed home with the baby. They were living in her parents' garage in Long Beach. It was the size of a studio apartment, and she wanted out. As for Skylar, he wanted money for a sex change. Yep, you heard that right. He already put down a pretty big down payment on the surgery, which put them even farther in the hole. So they came up with this heinous plan. It wasn't the first time he had resorted to the worst of the worst. In 2003, while he was doing time at the Seal Beach jail, the same place he met Alonzo Machane, he made friends with another inmate, a guy named John Peter Jarvie. You already know that Skylar's one skill was convincing people to trust him, which is weird because he didn't make it as an actor. But in real life, he was an expert manipulator. And somehow, he managed to convince John Jarvie to stake him $50,000 for an investment opportunity in Mexico when he got out. Now, Skylar was still in jail, but he was on a work release program, so he had some freedom during the day as long as he reported back to jail at night. So he met up with John, and the two of them drove across the border to Mexico with the money supposedly to check out their investment. But you can probably guess that's not what happened. Almost as soon as they cleared the border, Skylar slashed his throat, took the cash, and left him to die alone on the side of the road. Now we have to assume Jennifer was in on that too, since it's not exactly easy for an inmate to waltz back into jail with $50,000 on them. But he did buy himself something nice. According to the Orange County Register, he used the prison computer to get online and buy himself an anal sex machine, which seems like kind of a redundant purchase for someone in prison. But there you have it. A year later, John Jarvie's $50,000 was long gone, and the Deleons were looking for a bigger score when they saw the Hawks advertisement in the yachting magazine. The Hawks' friends and family were used to them being off the grid, but after a few days of unreturned calls, they went looking. And frankly, Skylar and Jennifer chose the wrong couple to do this to. Tom's older brother was the former police chief in Carlsbad, California, and he knew something was very wrong when he saw the yacht in its slip, but it hadn't been tied up properly, and there were a few other things that were also off. Usually, the boat was very well maintained, but the deck looked dirty and things were out of place. A towel was hanging out of one of the portholes, and the couple's car was also missing. He left his card on the boat with instructions to call him, and the next day, his phone rang. It was Jennifer calling to say that she and her husband paid cash for the boat, and they hadn't seen or heard from Tom or Jackie since they closed the deal. Now, on the surface, it seemed like a reasonable explanation, but with a little digging, they discovered the Hawks never deposited the cash from the sale. In fact, their bank account and credit cards hadn't been touched since November 15th, and their silver Honda CR-V was also missing. 2 weeks after they vanished, they were reported missing. So they turned their attention to the last people they were seen with, the Deleons. And when they looked into them a little closer, what they found just didn't add up. The couple was swimming in debt. So how did they come up with that much cash to buy a yacht? And why did Tom and Jackie give them power of attorney over their finances? And the most chilling discovery? Skylar was a convicted felon on probation for armed robbery. When they searched the yacht, they found a Target receipt dated 13 days after the sea trial, just 1 day before the Hawks were reported missing. Someone went shopping for trash bags, bleach, and Tums. It didn't look good, and one of the detectives put it perfectly on 2020. If I was going to kill somebody, I'd have my clean kit, and it would be bags to get rid of evidence, bleach to wipe down the scene, and maybe, if I had a conscience, some Tums to settle my stomach after killing some poor people. But when they got the security footage to go with the purchase, the person on camera wasn't Skylar or Jennifer. It was Jennifer's father. He said they sent him to the store to get cleaning supplies for their boat. And when they talked to Jennifer, she made them believe she was just as concerned about the Hawks. She said they were also trying to reach them to find out what to do with the personal possessions they left on the boat. Plus, they had the paperwork to prove they bought it. And at first glance, everything seemed to be in order. They had the Hawks' signatures and fingerprints, and it was all notarized to boot. But there was still the question of the money. How did they afford it? And that's when Skylar confessed. Sort of. He told them he used drug money to buy it so he could make a better life for his family. His story went like this. He met Tom and Jackie in the parking lot at the docks with a briefcase full of cash. Jennifer, a notary, and Alonzo were also there. He explained that Alonzo was a friend from Mexico, there to witness the signing. Now, that became an important detail later, so it's pretty clear that he's not ad-libbing this story. This is planned. According to him, Tom took the briefcase, asked if all the money was there, and when Skylar told him it was, he and Jackie drove off in their Honda, and that's the last they saw of them. The end. It seemed like a reasonable story, so the police moved on, but the Deleons kept popping up to the top of the suspect list. 3 weeks after the Hawks vanished, Jennifer and Skylar were caught on camera withdrawing money from their account, which they could do because they had that signed power of attorney. And why would the Hawks give them power of attorney? They had an explanation for that, too. He and Alonzo were helping them buy a vacation place in Mexico, and even though the whole story stank to high heaven, there was nothing they could legally do about it. A little less than a month went by with no other leads, and the Hawks family was getting more and more frustrated. But then they thought, well, hey, if we can't find Tom and Jackie, maybe we can find their car. But they needed help to spread the story. That's where the press came in. They put out pictures and descriptions of the Honda, and they got a hit. A couple in San Miguel, Mexico called to say they'd seen the car at a nearby mobile home. A conversation with the homeowner confirmed their worst fears. Tom and Jackie weren't there. In fact, he didn't even know their names. He got the car from his friends, Skylar and Jennifer Deleon. On December 17th, 2004, Skylar was arrested, but not for murder. They didn't have enough proof to charge him with that yet, but he did confess to buying the boat with drug money, which is basically money laundering. So that's what they held him on while they kept digging. And they didn't have to dig too deep to find more they could use against him. When they searched the converted garage they were living in, they found Tom and Jackie's laptop and their video camera. Jennifer and Skylar had used it to record their family Thanksgiving just 2 weeks after they murdered the Hawks. There was still footage of Jackie and Tom on the camera. How cold-blooded do you have to be to do something like that? It's mind-blowing. But at this point, they still didn't have enough to put Jennifer away or charge Skylar with murder. They offered her immunity if she told them what had happened, but she refused. She just kept insisting that she had no idea what they were talking about. The stuff they found was left behind on the boat. It was starting to look like they might never be able to close the case, but then the first domino fell. The notary, Kathleen Harris, was key to making the forced paperwork look legit, and they leaned on her pretty hard several times, but she stuck to her story until she didn't. And she must have had a conscience unlike the others involved, and one day she came in and confessed. She had nothing to do with the murders. She'd never even met the Hawks, but the Deleons paid her cash to backdate the paperwork to November 15th, 2004. That was the missing piece they needed to take another look at the paperwork. And that's when they noticed that the S's on Jackie's last name looked different. It didn't look like her handwriting. Someone had added it later. And her quick thinking gave them a major clue that she didn't voluntarily hand over her assets like the Deleons said she did. Now that they had new information, they used it on the weakest link, Alonzo Machane. And once they offered him a deal for a lighter sentence in exchange for his testimony, he pretty quickly broke down and told them the horrific truth about what had happened on that boat November 15th. But his story had a bizarre twist. He claimed Skylar told him he was an international hitman and Tom and Jackie were taken out because they were evil. So obviously, Alonzo is the kind of guy who would make a great addition to a cult if he's that gullible. All 4 people involved were found guilty. Alonzo got 20 years because he was the star witness. Jennifer got life without parole, and John Kennedy and Skylar got the death penalty. But in California, no one actually gets lethal injection, but they are on death row. And that's not quite the end of the story. There's one more twist you're going to want to hear. Skylar got his wish. He said he took their lives, their yacht, and their life savings to finance his sex change, and the state of California gave it to him. Kind of. In 2009, after he was convicted, Skylar tried to cut off his penis with a disposable razor. The way he tells it to 2020, he took a sheet, tied it around it to stop the blood flow, and started hacking away. He might have died if the guards hadn't gotten to him fast enough. They didn't exactly give him the surgery to reassign his gender, but they did give him the hormones necessary. And in 2019, his gender was officially changed to female in the records. He asked to move to a female prison because he said he gets along with women better, but so far, she's still in San Quentin. So at least she didn't get everything she wanted. Unfortunately, Tom and Jackie didn't get the chance to live out their future the way they were hoping to. And that's your recap. What do you think of the way this tragic case turned out? Let's discuss in the comments below, but don't go away. We've got another recap coming up for you right now.